Our next speaker is Engineering Professor Alfonso. He's an expert in materials, and he's going to talk to us about micro robotics. Alfonso, please.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Alex Chen. So when Dr. Chen kindly invited me to give this talk, I already decided that this will be the topic that I'll talk about. But at that time, we were also finishing this book. So when the Secretariat chased me up for a title, then I thought, well, I might as well use this book cover to be my first slide. So the title is, as you can read from here, we're going to talk about some stimuli responsive actuating materials to drive micro robots. So this book will appear soon. This is being produced, and it's done by this Actor Materialia series. My co-author is here, Kenneth Kwan, Dr. Kwan, somewhere sitting in the audience. And in the talk that I'll give right now, I actually will highlight some of the work that my students have done. So including Ms. Rundy Wu, who is also here, and some others who have left. Okay. So Professor Lui has reminded us through his talk that we now live in this AI world. This is for sure, which is everybody cannot deny. But a lot of others have also advocated that AI can't ever reach its full potential without a physical material body. So this is always the interaction between the digital part and the physical part. So that's why in the materials community, a few of us are trying to push this concept, which is not AI, but MI, material intelligence. So this is to make use of smart materials to achieve some intelligent robotic functions. And these materials that we are talking about, and I will highlight some of these in my talk, they are stimuli responsive materials. So upon receiving some stimuli from the environment, they will have certain responses. And in our case, we will focus on mainly actuation and sensing. So hopefully, the kind of functions that we'll achieve would include things like, as I said, sensing, actuation, and in the future, it could be even adaptive or learn from the environment. And another highlight or another important point about this MI concept is delocalization. So unlike big electromechanical systems where which are driven by motors and gears and all these things, where each component serves one function or each component provides one degree of freedom, we may be talking about spreading out the materials, and these materials could also provide you different functions, but everything would be within a compact design. So pretty much like our human body, right? Okay, so this book that we are publishing, the first part of it will be a review of some of the traditional or typical stimuli responsive materials, named as RMs, right? So these are the materials that have been available for some time. So including electroactive polymers, conductive polymers, shape memory polymers. So a lot of these are actually polymers. And also liquid crystal elastomers, also polymers, and even clean metallic surfaces. So these are the kind of materials that are available for some time, as I said. But then at Hong Kong U, over the last, I would say, few years, we are discovering and exploiting a new type of these SRMs. We call them TMOs, stand for transitional metal oxide, hydroxide, oxyhydroxide is again a very long name, but essentially these are the few examples. All right, this one is actually quite well known to people working on batteries. because this is the nickel hydride electrode system. But we are going to use the material in the reverse way, not in the battery way, which I'll explain later on. So to avoid quoting all these long chemical names, we use these acronyms, NHO. And then a similar system is the cobalt system, cobalt hydroxide, oxyhydroxide system. We call them, we call it COH, and then manganese oxide, etc., etc. So we have been developing 3 or 4 of these materials so far. These TMOs are quite interesting because they exhibit a dual actuation mechanism. So one single material can be triggered by 2 types of signals. So one is electrochemical potentials. So you immerse the material in some electrolyte and then apply a voltage between the material and the electrolyte, the material can move. And we will be talking about very lean inputs. You'll see a lot of examples later on. So we'll be talking about voltages much less than 1 volt. The other type of stimuli would be photothermal. So either light or heat, right? So you can shine light onto the material, they can move. And also the input is very lean as well. We'll be talking about less than 1 sunlight intensity. So even on the cloudy day like today, the kind of intensity will be able to drive the material to move. And also temperature rise, it can be done by Joule heating, which is an easier way of delivering the stimuli because you can use electricity, or you can reduce the humidity in the environment. The material can also move. So this movie is not sped up. This is the real time. The kind of voltage involved is, as I said, less than 1 volt. Sorry, it's a bit jumpy. Okay. Doesn't happen in my computer, but it happens in this computer. There is some synchronization problem. Okay, so this is the real speed of the motion. So the current is going up and down. This is how we program the input. So in a nutshell, the motion of these TMOs is rapid, as you can see, can be complicated. But if you notice, the repeated cycle is consistent. Every time it goes back to the same shape. So I said that there are 2 mechanisms. So the one that you have seen just now was the electrochemical actuation. To prove that this is really some redox reaction driving the motion, we now deliberately slow down the signal. So this is the type of material that would exhibit this oxidation and reduction. When the material is oxidized, the unit cell, the volume of the material actually decreases, as you can see from the red number at the top. So when the voltage now enters into the oxidation, the material shrinks. So in this case, we have the active material coated on the top of some passive layer. So when the top layer shrinks, it will curl up, as you can see. And when the voltage now enters the reduction range, it will flex back. So that is the electrochemical actuation. The same sample, you don't even need to produce another sample. The same sample, you now lift it out of the liquid electrolyte just to put it into some atmosphere, just like ambient atmosphere with some humidity or air environment. If you just shine the material with some laser pointer, just like this one that I'm using, it will curl, right? And this is a piece of wet sponge. So there is a gradient in the humidity in this direction. So if you lift the material up and down, the shape will change. So it responds to light, it responds to humidity change. And in terms of the light, these are the different frequency ranges. So visible light range, ultraviolet, near infrared. Fortunately for application, the material responds the best to visible light. Visible light is the most accessible and less dangerous to work with. So that's the light response. So in terms of the mechanism for light response, all the experiments that we have carried out show that this is due to this very special structure of the material that we call turbostratic crystal structure. So a normal ideal crystal would have this ordered arrangement. So you have atomic planes and they are very regularly arranged. But in this type of material, there is a lot of water intercalated inside. So these water molecules actually perturb these crystal planes. So that's why if you look at the material in a TEM, you would never see all the usual ordered image that you would see or contrast that you would see. You will see all these fuzzy type of contrast, which is indicative of this so-called turbostratic crystal structure. So therefore, the material would respond to photothermal stimuli if water molecules are driven out. Okay, so if water molecules are driven out, the material will shrink. So how to prove that? One experiment that we have done is to put a light source inside the XRD, X-ray diffractometer. So every time we switch on the light source, to go from the blue to the red, there is a right shift of the peak corresponding to this basal plane of the HCP crystal structure. Right shift means a reduction in lattice spacing. So that proves the fact that the lattice spacing is reducing. Another proof is that we can measure the material, the mass of the material with or without the light. So every time we switch on the light, the material actually becomes lighter in weight. So something is coming out of the material. And then when we switch off the light, the weight regains to more or less its original value. So something is now sucked back into the material to increase the weight. And then this group in Imperial, after seeing our paper, they performed this very interesting experiment. They used deuterium, which is heavy water. Basically, these water molecules are labeled. So by running through the sample through this time of flight sims, they can actually prove that it's the water going in and out of the material when you have the actuation going on. So in terms of the load carrying capability, it is quite a big leverage. The material can lift a few thousand times of its own weight. This is the cobalt system, COH system. So of course it depends on the light intensity. So 50 of that unit means half of a sun. One sun is 100 of that unit. So a cloudy day like today would be somewhere between 20 and 50. So it can in terms of load lifting, the leverage is quite high. And some people may worry about the durability. So whether metal fatigue or material fatigue can occur. So we have run a lot of these tests. So over several thousand cycles, no problem at all. The behavior is still pretty steady after 5,000 cycles. So this is an atlas comparing the different materials. So most of these, as I have said earlier, those were the traditional or readily available materials. Our own muscles are here. So this is our own human muscle in terms of the stress and strain, actuating stress and strain. So how much stress we can deliver and over how much strain. So we are basically, we can deliver pretty large strain but at a low stress. So as I said, a lot of these actuating materials are polymers. So they would belong to the soft actuators group, meaning that they can produce large strains, but not very high stresses. So these are just the nicknames. Some of these I mentioned earlier on. Our material TMO would fall into the hot actuator category because these are oxides or hydroxides. So in terms of the stress strain, they are in that range, which is already pretty good compared with some of these other materials. But the real advantages are listed on the right-hand side in here. First of all, as I said, their input requirements are very lean, either electrochemical or light or photothermal. Cost is actually very low because all the raw materials are not expensive compared to some of the things that I'll mention later on. For example, these nanoporous metals, which are basically noble metals like gold, platinum. They are very expensive, although they have higher stress. And stress strain is pretty good in terms of the hard actuators, right? This is not linear scale, this is log scale. And as we have seen, the response is pretty fast. The last but not the least, these materials are easily manufactured just by electrodeposition. So that means that they can be integrated with other materials to make different or even complex devices. So in what follows, I will walk you through a few rather interesting technologies that we also have developed in order to use these materials in devices. Things like how to improve the interfacial strength between the active material and the substrate, how to position materials at where you want them to be, quite interesting. In terms of the electrochemical actuation, you need an electrolyte, which is usually a liquid, right? But there are ways to package up the electrolyte so that you can now employ the material in air, and also how to build in intelligence into the devices. So improving the adhesion with the substrate, Runny, sitting over there, invented this method, which we call micro riveting. We all know what are rivets, but this is micro scale. So she sourced a type of microporous polycarbonate substrate. This is the type of material that water resources people would use to do filtering. So these are materials that are easily purchased or procured. So there are holes in such membranes. The pore size can be in this range. So it could go from less than a micron to 10 microns. So these are the pores. And then we deposit these TMO material on top. So therefore the material can actually be grown inside the pore to serve as rivets, but in a micro scale. We do that because the intrinsic adhesion between these oxides or hydroxides with polymer is weak. Okay, so by doing that, let's say this is such a material or such a assembly of materials, you can see that it can bend to a curvature of around or radius of curvature of around one millimeter, which is quite useful in a lot of applications. And in terms of how much curvature the system can sustain, if you do not have any pores, basically it cannot sustain a lot of bending. Delamination will easily occur, but with the pores, the bending can be enhanced a lot. Secondly, how to position materials where you want them to be. The traditional method would be to use masked electrodeposition. So I don't need to describe this because this is a kind of well-known method for lithography. So you just need a mask, and then you use the mask to shield off regions where you don't want the material to go to. So this is one traditional way. And we use that method to produce these origami robots. So this black stuff is the active material. The gray or translucent substrate is the microporous polycarbonate. On the left-hand side, this is light actuation. So I make use of this LED light for camping, which you can buy from a metal shop. And then you will see the movement. On the right-hand side, this is electrochemical actuation. So this is now in some electrolyte, sodium hydroxide. So that is workable using the mass electrodeposition. Another way is to write the material using what people call open electrodeposition. So in this case, you do not use a whole beaker of electrolyte to fabricate the material, but in fact, you deliver the electrolyte into where you want the material to go. So through this voltage applied between the electrolyte and the substrate, which needs to be conductive in this case, because the substrate would serve as another electrode, the in situ reaction would happen at this junction to produce the TMO that you want to achieve. So in this case, we are writing HKU, but you notice that the deposit now is brown in color, while the electrolyte, which is copper sulfate in this case, is blue in color. So that means that there is an in situ chemical reaction going on. So the product is formed instantly. So using that method, we can do many things. We can, for example, in this illustration, we can write these actuating hinges. So the black stuff is the active material. And in this case, we manufacture two types of actuating hinges. So this is supposed to be a robotic arm lifting, as you can see from the movie, lifting some weight, right? But we also make use of the concept of on-demand stiffness control. So to increase the load carrying capability of this arm, we need to stiffen it. So how do we stiffen it? We use this second set of actuating hinges to make this transverse curvature. So once the body of the robotic arm is curled up in the transverse direction, the second moment of area, if you remember mechanics, would increase, and therefore the arm will be stiffened, and that will enable you to lift a bigger load. So at the end of it, you can see that you can poke it, and it is quite rigid after you develop this transverse curvature. So this is on demand. You can switch on and switch off that stiffening as you wish. And this is another application of that direct writing. So Runny produced this model of a human hand with all the finger joints individually controlled, right? So that one you cannot use mass electrodeposition, because mass electrodeposition, all the materials have to be deposited on the same metallized surface. So you cannot independently switch on and switch off them. So this one, we have each of the hinge produced on its individual region, which is metallized in the substrate. So that's why you can connect, electrically connect to the different regions separately, and therefore have separate control of each of the hinges. So the hand can give you different signals, as the movie has shown. So this one is about packaging up the electrolyte so that you can have something that will work in air, even though you have electrochemical actuation. So our first design is just to use surface tension to hold up the electrolyte. So we have a pair of those actuators, and then we just, as I said, use surface tension to hold up. In this case, the electrolyte is sodium hydroxide, and you can see the movement which is pretty good, right? And this is real time. This is not sped up. And you can also use a hydrogel to be the electrolyte instead of liquid electrolyte. You can use gel to be electrolyte. So in this case, the TMO is the manganese oxide, and then the hydrogel is gelatin glycerol. So we have now made two actuating hinges here, and they are separately connected electrically. So that's why you can supply different signals to the two hinges, and then the actuator will give you different shapes. And this is a micro robotic yoga making use of the same hydrogel to be the electrolyte. This is working in the air. Finally, how to build intelligence into devices. We need to integrate different materials together. So some materials may function as actuator, some materials may function as sensor, some materials may even function as power generator, which we haven't done yet, but hopefully it could be done in the future. So paraphrasing with the biological system, you should have muscle, nerve, mitochondria, and I forgot to mention here also the skeleton, right? The structural parts, the bones, in other words. So this is also a TMO with the hydrogel system, the same gelatin glycerol. So this is an actuator sensor compact construct. So the TMO is for actuation. The gel, as I said, is for providing as the electrolyte, but also this type of gel is also strain sensing. So if you squash the gel, the electrical resistance will change, and the change is pretty linear with respect to the strain. So this is a rather useful material to be used together with the TMO. So again, Ronnie has developed this micro-robotic insect, inchworm, that could crawl as well as sense. So when it is being pressed, the resistance signal will change, so that the insect would know that it is being compressed. And then when it crawls, because the body moves, so the resistance also changes, because the body is strained while it is moving. So from these signals, we haven't gone to that stage yet, but one could make use of these signals to do active control. This is another interesting material system where you use the TMO together with this multi-layer graphene. Multi-layer graphene is good for, again, strain sensing. So the problem with hydrogel is that they will dry up over time, but not for graphene, okay? And then graphene, because of the overlapping graphene flakes, so if you strain the system, the electrical resistance will change because of the conductive path length will change. So that is also a good strain sensing system. And in terms of application, I will showcase one or two possibilities for applications. One would be to develop tactile VR. So going back to AI versus MI, right? AI provides the digital. You also need the physical material component. So these materials could serve that kind of functions. So one application along the direction would be robotic hair, making use of that graphene and the TMO system. Again, this is Ronnie's work. So this is the real anatomy of mammalian hair. So as you know, our hair will stand up when the environment is cold. The hair will fall down when the environment is hot. What else? If you just strike the hair, we know that we are touched. Okay, so all these can be replicated in this system because of the combined actuation as well as sensing capability. Okay, so basically the resistance will change as you swipe the hair, and if you heat the hair up, it will fall down, as you can see. Another line of applications would be, as the title says, to drive robots. So just to illustrate that even robotics could be multi-scale. So we use the word multi-scale all the time. So it could go from molecular scale to the humanoid scale. But the kind of scale that these TMOs or SRMs would fit into would be this kind of range. So millimeter, micron, that kind of range, which would be called the insect scale. In this scale, this is too small for these big things like motors and hydraulic systems, right? But too large for the molecular motors for people from chemistry. So these active materials would fit into that kind of scale. And you have seen the example of the inchworm just now. So I show this table from the book. And find this table quite interesting. I took some time to compile it. So here we compare big things like a jumbo jet to like the smallest insect, a fly, a fruit fly. So in terms of the body weight, this is colossal magnitude, scale in difference in scale. Also in functional power, okay? But if you convert into power density, so you take the functional power divided by the body weight, not the entire body weight, but the weight of the machine. So you take the jets rather than the entire plane, right? The numbers are a lot closer to one another now. Okay, so that's quite interesting. And it tends to go down as we go down the scale. So Tesla is right there. We are here. Okay, around 100 of this unit. Okay, and then functional power to body weight. So you now take the power, but divide by the body weight now. All right, these are the numbers. Okay, so you can see that we are not particularly good as compared to others. We are only 7 of this unit. All right, so we are very weak in muscles, but fortunately our brains are very powerful. All right, so we are even worse than insects in terms of our muscles. And in terms of efficiencies, we know that jet engines are limited by the Carnot cycle, Spitfire, internal combustion engine also in that range. Motors for Tesla, as you know, is very high. Electric motors very efficient. And then we are like 25%, and then all the insects, all these living things are close to us, 25%. In terms of these SRMs, they are more or less in this range. Some better ones can rival electric motors, okay? But most others would work in this range. So that's one interesting comparison. I have about 15 minutes left, something like that, half an hour. All right, so the second half of my talk, I will talk about things that worry me as a material scientist. So apart from making the materials and showing that they can perform some functions, of course, deep in our mind would be the actual mechanisms and mechanics, right? So there will be some equations. I apologize for that. Now, going back to the electrochemical actuation, I did say that there was a type of traditional materials called nanoporous metals. And I said that those were expensive noble metals, things like gold, platinum. So for these metals, there is no oxide layer on the surface. That's why they're so expensive, and that's why they are so noble, so inert. So when you have such clean metallic surfaces, and if you dump them into some electrolyte and connect up a voltage between the electrolyte and the metal, you would have this, what we call the EDL mechanism. EDL stands for electric double layer. So let's say if you charge the material positively, the positive charge here will induce these dipoles in the electrolyte. So the negative ends of the dipoles will point towards the metal. And once this is done, the positive parts of the dipoles will drive away the free electrons in the metal. Okay, so that's why the first few atomic layers in the metal will now be depleted of electrons. And therefore, the positive nuclei of the metal will repel. Okay, so this is a very simple actuation mechanism that has been demonstrated for clean metallic surfaces. But to magnify this effect, they have to increase the surface area to volume ratio. That's why if you have a bulk piece, if you take your wedding ring, it probably won't work. You have to dramatically increase the surface area to volume ratio. And how do they do that? They turn the material into some nanoporous structure. So how to make these materials? They use a eutectic material system and etch away one of the faces. So after you have done that, you have all these nanoporous. So the pore size is kind of like a few nanometers. So therefore you have a gigantic ratio of surface area to volume ratio. And therefore the EDL actuation could be rather large, as you have seen in the atlas that I have shown just now. So that effect has been known for some time. So dating back to more than 10 years ago, 2010. And then at that era, people thought that, oh, only noble metals would have that behavior. But then we also discovered that non-noble metals like nickel, as long as we turn them into a similar nanostructure, they would also exhibit a similar effect. So this is a very beautiful microstructure that Chuan, who is now in Newcastle upon Tyne in England, as a teaching staff over there, as a young professor over there, has done a few years back. So he used this template, which is aluminum oxide, anodized aluminum oxide, and turn that, so grow the nickel inside these nano honeycomb structure to form this nickel nano honeycomb, and then do the electrochemical actuation. So as you can see, there is actuation, there is displacement, okay, when you apply this voltage pulses. But it's not large, right? The displacement is 0.1 of a millimeter. It's not large, but the effect is there. So that was the effect that I just talked about. That was the EDL actuation. But for nickel, as long as we turn it into hydroxide, it could also have that redox reaction that I talked about. When it is oxidized, the volume will decrease, right? So these are two distinctively different mechanisms. The signs are also opposite. So this one, I mentioned that if you positively charge the metal will expand because you drive the free electrons away, and therefore these nuclei would repel. So the metal would expand. For that one, if you positively charge the material will undergo oxidation, and then the volume should shrink. So the directions are opposite. And indeed, we observe both. Okay, so when you freshly prepare these nickel nano honeycombs, and then do the actuation test immediately, you would not form the hydroxide or oxide. Then you would have the EDL mechanism, and then you see that the strain is positive, meaning that it's expansion. But if you prepare these nano honeycombs now, but just dip it into the sodium hydroxide for like a day before the actuation test, the material will oxidize into the hydroxide, this one. And then as you now carry out the actuation test, the strain is now negative. Okay, so we observe these two opposite behaviors. And also, if you look at the scale, this is 10 to the power minus 6. This is 10 to the power minus 4. So this redox reaction, this redox actuation is 100 times larger. So that's quite interesting. Same material, but you can have two mechanisms. There are further experiments that you can do to dig deeper into that two types of mechanisms. So if you run electrochemical tests like cyclic voltammetry, or what people call EIS, electrical impedance spectroscopy. Okay, if you have the EDL mechanism, so going back to that cartoon now, in terms of electric circuit, this is like a capacitor. So if you do potential switching across the capacitor, you would know that the capacitance in terms of the impedance plot is imaginary, purely imaginary, meaning that the current will have a 90 degrees phase difference with respect to the driving voltage. Okay, so if you see a vertical line in the Nyquist plot, you can infer that the mechanism is EDL. On the other hand, if you have the redox reaction, all right, that's what people call the pseudo-capacitive charge transfer. The usual electric circuit for redox reaction is a resistance or resistor in parallel with possibly also this EDL capacitor. So if you look at the Nyquist plot, the imaginary complex number plot of the impedance, you should see a semicircle. Okay, all these are just control theory, year 2, year 3 control theory in universities. That's the CV, that's the cyclic voltammetry. So the first thing that we observe is that, also I forgot to mention, there are other characteristics as well. For the EDL, the charge is proportional to voltage. That's what a capacitor will do. Okay, so if you differentiate that equation, so dq dt becomes your current. So the current will now be proportional to the voltage rate. Okay, so that would be the characteristic of the EDL. If you charge up this material with a constant voltage rate, the current should be proportional to that. While if you have the charge transfer mechanism, the charge is delivered by diffusion. So for diffusion, Q is proportional to square root dt, where d is the diffusion coefficient. So if you have a constant voltage rate, okay, because of the T in here, the current will be proportional to the square root of the voltage rate. So one is linear, one is square root. So by these two, you can also distinguish between the two mechanisms. So for the first one, in here, when we have the redox, this peak for oxidation or that peak for the reduction, you measure the current and then you use different V, the different voltage rate, you would observe this square root dependence. So that already gives you a hint that this is due to the redox reaction. And then this is EIS, okay? And then if you now scan your voltage, but as you scan your voltage, you avoid entering into the oxidation regime. So you just scan from here to there without kicking into the oxidation. All right. The result would be a nearly vertical line in the complex number plot for the impedance. So that also means that this is capacitance driven. Okay, so from here to there, you don't have redox, you only have EDL. But if you now cover the redox, the oxidation and the resistance, the Nyquist plot changes from this vertical line to a semicircle. as I've just said. So this means that the oxidation peak now will change the circuit now into this parallel arrangement between a capacitor and a resistor. So which one dominates? You have the EDL, you have the redox, both applicable to this nickel or nickel hydroxide system. Which one will dominate? This is an interesting question back then when we discovered the dual mechanism. A very busy graph, but essentially, when redox reaction occurs, the actuation strain increases rapidly. So that is the redox regime. However, so we do want the redox because, as I said earlier on, redox will give you 100 times bigger in terms of the actuation. So we do want the redox. However, whether redox can occur or not depends on, of course, your voltage range, but also the scan speed. Okay, because this is diffusion controlled. So here you see the scan plot at different scan speeds. So only if you scan slowly, like 10 millivolt per second, you can have the green, and that can have the redox, which is this big elevation. If you scan very quickly, 1,000 millivolt per second, that curve remain very low and flat. So you only would have the EDL dominating. So that's what this graph summarizes. So that's the scan rate. Okay, so when the scan rate is low, you can have the redox happening. And when you do have the redox happening, you can have a big increment in the actuating strain. Okay, but when you have fast scanning rate, the redox cannot happen. You can only have the EDL. So that's quite interesting material system, which exhibits this dual behavior in electrochemical actuation. And then in what follows, I will walk you through some chemomechanics analysis. So this is always the system that we are considering. We have an active layer that can expand or shrink, supported by a layer that does not change. So when the top layer shrinks, it will develop an upward curvature. Okay, if you go back to the very old Timoshenko theory, more than 100 years old, that's also from our year 1 or year 2 mechanics course. A lot of those equations are very useful in this field actually, because the system is exactly a bilayer. Okay, so the curvature from that theory is a bunch of constants depending on the thicknesses of these two layers and their Young's moduli. Okay, so for a given dimension or geometry and material system, that is a constant. Okay, and of course, if you have a bigger actuating stress in the active layer, the more should be the curvature, actuating curvature. So experimentally, you can do the reverse. You can measure the curvature experimentally, and then you know this factor, then you can work out what is the actuating stress. So you just reverse that equation, then that allows you to work out the actuating stress. You can also make use of other equations in that theory to work out the actuating strain. So the system is like a dashpot connected in series with elastic resistance, because if the top layer shrinks, it's like you have a dashpot shrinking, right? You have some shrinkage, but then because of the elasticity in the entire system, so you have some elastic resistance. So the relation between the stress and the strain is via this equation. So for electrochemical actuation, these are the experiment results. So the experimental curvature plotted as a function of this factor, because we can produce different actuators using different materials and also different thicknesses. So that factor can be varied. Okay, and then we observe a pretty straight line. So in this case, the active layer is fixed to be this NHO system. So that means that the NHO system in the sodium hydroxide electrolyte can give an actuating stress, which is given by this slope, around 20 megapascal. Not bad already. That 20 megapascal is many times compared to our human muscle. And then in terms of the stress strain, because you can make use of these equations, the stress is quite constant. This is another material system, the manganese oxide, right? Not the nickel hydroxide. Now the actuating stress is even higher, 60 megapascal, and it's pretty independent on the strain. So this is like a constant stress actuating material. If you make use of the electrochemical actuation, quite interesting. Why? BC diagram. This is the so-called bold diagram for this well-known material. So many different phases, okay? But for electrochemical actuation, we simply make use of the transition between these two phases. So the hydroxide transforming into the oxyhydroxide, and that involves insertion of some cations in the electrolyte. So it depends on what electrolyte that you're using. If you use sodium hydroxide, then the cation would be sodium. If you use potassium hydroxide, then the cation would be potassium. So because of the insertion, okay, the activation volume is large. And also the crystal structure also changes. And that's why the activation volume is large, and therefore the stress dependence is high. So therefore, the stress is pretty constant. What about light actuation? Now we do the same plot. So plotting curvature versus that factor that we can vary by making different actuators. You don't see a linear plot anymore. So if you do the light actuation, the material is not giving you a constant average actuating stress, which is quite interesting, right? So the behavior is totally different. And if you look at the speed of the actuation, there is a fast range followed by a slow range. Okay, so this is actuation versus time. So initially the response is fast and then it slows down. And then if you plot the square root of the time to actuation, so that kind of time, versus the thickness of the active layer, you see more or less a linear plot. So that tells you that diffusion is also involved. So light actuation is a lot more complicated because light can only penetrate a very shallow layer initially. So this is the actuator. The green is the active layer. You shine light from the right-hand side. The light can only trigger only the very surface of the active layer initially. So that's this fast response. So that is quite instant, quite quick, right? And that's by removing water, as I said, from the turbostratic crystal structure. But once the surface layer becomes drier, diffusion would occur. So the water from the remainder of the active layer will gradually diffuse out, and then the entire active layer will now shrink as a whole. And that is this slow process. So the light actuation is a lot more complicated than electrochemical actuation, as we have now found out. Very busy graph, sorry about that. But basically, if you just want to understand the surface stress, because this is the triggered layer by the light, okay, it differs from the average stress by this factor. So we also have this compliance linking the actuating strain and the surface stress given by this expression, which looks complicated, but it is exact. Again, it comes from an extension of the Timoshenko theory that a smart PhD student can do. And then if you look at this surface, so this CA, which is the compliance, right? You look at the dimensionless version of that, that only depends on the thickness ratio and the modulus ratio. And the surface has two branches. Quite interestingly, there is a singularity line, but there are two branches. So one branch is that the value is higher than 2. The other branch is that the value is lower than -1. So between -1 and 2, there is no value for the CA. So that means that this stress strain curve, because that is the compliance between the strain and the stress. So that means that the stress strain curve has two bounds. Okay. And then when you really plug in the experimental data, you measure the K, the curvature, the kappa, and then work out, here, you plug in the experimental curvature, you calculate the stress and the strain, you plot them out. Now you see that basically, at least for quite a large range, the behavior is constant strain, no longer constant stress. So quite interesting. Electrochemical actuation, constant stress, but light actuation, constant strain. Quite interesting. So light actuation gives steady actuating strain until it is limited by that bound, right? So it goes from here and then bends towards the bound. Okay. Why is it like that? Constant strain. Again, this is due to water removal, a very busy graph, but basically you remove the free water content. So in the turbostratic structure, there are two types of water. One is called structural water, which is hard to remove. They are bound rather tightly to the structure. The other one would be the excess water, which can come out very easily. So if you remove water molecules one by one, each water molecule has a very small volume. So the activation volume is very small compared to the electrochemical actuation, where I said that because of the cation insertion and the structure change, the activation volume was large. Here, the activation volume is small, and therefore the behavior gives more or less a narrow range of the strain. So the strain is rather narrow. So at least that is the theory right now that we believe. So this is again to show the complexity of the mechanics. Okay, so I just described the mechanics part. There is a dashpot working against the elasticity of the system. Okay, so you have this equation, but you have two unknowns, right? You have the strain, you have the stress, and then you can ask, okay, then what decides when the actuator will stop? So you need another equation because of the two unknowns. So you also need the chemistry characteristic. So the chemistry characteristic will be this curve, and then the elasticity will be that curve, and then the crossing point will give you the equilibrium, which is equilibrium between the mechanics and the chemistry. So this opens up a new topic, which is called chemomechanical mechanics, which is quite interesting. And then if you, again, further massage the Timoshenko equations, you can show this equilibrium condition is given by this. And then using that equilibrium, you can back out material properties of the actuation. Curvature itself is not a material property because it depends also on the substrate, right? But using this theory, you can work out the material properties like the activation energy versus light intensity. Okay, I know my time is coming up, so this is about my last slide, or last but one slide. There is also a very interesting phenomenon coming out from that chemomechanics consideration, and that is an instability. So the actuation can become unstable. When you hear the word unstable, it sounds bad, but in this case, it's good because when the actuation is unstable, it means that the actuation can be super large. All right. So this happens because of this very simple understanding. In terms of light actuation, it first of all strains the surface layer. Okay, then it bends the whole beam, And when the beam is bent, it pushes the upper layer into compressive stress. And that further squeezes out the water. So this is a positive feedback. So therefore, if you can have that kind of scenario, which is mathematically given by the fact that the chemistry characteristic and the mechanics characteristic become parallel. So there is no intersection. And mathematically, that is given by this condition, then you can have super large actuation. And experimentally, we have also discovered that. Okay, so these few data points correspond to super large actuation. And that happens when you have that magic condition satisfied, which was to have the omega, the normalized activation volume equals to the normalized compliance. Okay, this is my last slide, Dr. Chen. So in the university, we have to give interesting experience to our students. So as I have said, I'm very fortunate to have a very good group of students spending time with me on this project. But also in terms of undergrad, they have also made rather interesting things over the last few years. So driving a boat, this is interesting, auto-focusing lens. So this is the actuator, and you have an electrolyte droplet. So that droplet serves as the electrolyte for the electrochemical actuation, but also as the lens. So by causing this ring to shrink, you actually squeezes the droplet into higher curvature, and that will now become a converging lens, okay? And this is a little very compliant mechanical tester for soft materials. So with that, I would like to stop. This is my concluding remark. So MI is forthcoming. Watch out for that. And let's imagine the unimaginable in all these other things. Tactile VR, robotic insects. Someday we may be able to rival. I think we have beaten our own muscle by the 60 or 20 megapascal. I don't know, one day we can make these strange monsters as predicted by Frankenstein. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alfonso, for such an interesting topic after the previous one, Michael, on AI. And I don't know how many eyes we're going to get, but let's start with some questions, in particular with the research co-workers under Alfonso for some time. Okay, the floor is open. May I, can we have the first question? You all know the subject well? Good. So, yes. Yes, one question, please.
So the example you showed where you're operating near that instability, it looks very difficult to actually design around because it's an instability. So how do you actually use that in practice?
Well, you have to just choose the thickness ratio right. So the key thing is this equation, which satisfies the mechanics chemo equilibrium. So K is the normalized curvature, the bigger, the better. And this is just a surface of alpha, beta, phi, sorry, omega, 4 variables. So alpha is the thickness ratio, beta the Young's modulus ratio, phi is the driving force, omega is the activation volume. So you just need to make sure that the omega is larger than 2. Okay, so you have to choose the right system, the right material in the system, so that the normalized activation energy is larger than 2, and then the alpha is the value predicted by this equation. There is a singularity, mathematical singularity, when alpha is this magic number. So that's the theoretical guide. Experimentally, we were able to achieve just a few points. So altogether, there are something like 83, 84 actuators that the student has made, and only a few would encounter that instability.
I see. So any error in any error variation in the thickness will give you a very large variation in the achievable curvature.
Well, theory is theory, because this is Timoshenko. You know that this is elasticity, purely linear, everything, and in reality, you would not have everything being linear. So probably that is the reason why we only could achieve a few points.
Okay, next one. I think Yogo, you got the right. You got the mic. So
thank you, sir. I'm not in the material area, but thanks for exciting talk. At one stage, you mentioned this material can be used for robots that's basically a millimeter range. Is that due to the limit of diffusion process or the design?
Yes, diffusion. Is diffusion limited, so the material cannot be too thick. That's the application side of the constraint. In terms of the fabrication side, there is a constraint too, because these are not really good electrical conductors, so we cannot grow them too thick. A few microns, 10 microns would be like the limit, of course, depending on material. But we are also thinking ways of upscaling the whole thing. So we cannot get away with the coating configuration. So the material has got to be coated on something, but that something may not be a flat layer, right? It could be some fabric, some cotton, some sponge. So we are working hard along that direction. One day we may be able to achieve a 3-dimensional construct that can dance, jump up and down.
That's what I
whatever.
thought, that as you move your imagination towards the last slide, and then I thought you mentioned the word, you did not mention skeleton, the
Yes.
bones. Yeah, so then you probably can.
Yeah, that will kick in.
Yeah,
Yes.
you jump.
Yes.
After you, did you have a question?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
He raised his hand.
Sorry.
Thank you. Yes,
That was a wonderful presentation, Doctor. Actually, it's not totally related to this, but I have a question. Is there a possibility for this? Is there a possibility that we can have this material intelligence in human muscles, as in a medical field, that we can replace human muscles with this? I know it's purely a sci-fi, but I'm just really curious. Like, is there a possibility we could?
Oh, Kenneth is sitting there. Actually, how
Yeah.
Kenneth got into this field was a mistake, right? He started his PhD initially by modeling shy grass. You know, there's a type of grass in Chinese we call shy grass. You touch it, it will shrink. So his very first paper was published with our botanist in our School of Botany. I think there is a lot of room of merging physical with biology, not only with digital, I guess, merging physical with biology, and it's not my field, but for people working on cells, they can replicate the cytoskeleton of cells in an in vitro environment, and have the dynamic polymerization and depolymerization going on, and therefore the thing can move in a liquid. But that range would be somewhere between the molecular scale that I mentioned and the insect scale. The molecular scale is truly molecular. We have a Nobel chemist in our university, and he won his Nobel Prize based on that, Professor Studat, Fraser Studat. So he's, that community is really the molecular one. But in terms of the cells or the cytoskeleton in cells, they are much bigger than molecular. So I think there is a lot of room in that. So that's what I meant by imagine the unimaginable. We need young people in this field.
Let's give our senior fellow a chance to ask a question.
Tough question.
Being senior doesn't mean intelligence.
No.
Can I ask a general question, Alfonso? I heard that this would give us a lot more efficiency in terms of input power. Do you see that in long-term future, we can do away with engines and motors and use a lot less energy, and therefore our carbon neutrality goals could be achieved quicker?
For the type of scale that motor works just like Tesla, well, of course, it's my only view. I think nothing will beat motors. If you do electrical engineering, please be assured nothing will beat electric motors. They are very cheap to make in mass quantities, very reliable, very powerful, very high in efficiency. So our goal is not to replace motors in humanoid robots, but for devices or machines where you cannot fit in an electric motor. So we do have, I cannot show the details because I've signed a non-disclosure with some companies. They're quite interested in using these materials to drive certain devices where the space is not big enough for an electric motor. And certainly not jet engines. I think they will be a while. They will be around for a while.
Okay.
Yes, Professor Luke.
Yeah, but I'm very exciting topic because I think your material may be useful for my antenna design because I'm designing a floatable antenna and beam scanning antenna. So one question: how large you can make using a currently? What's the maximum size that you can make? And my second question is: can you attach your material to different kind of polymers?
I think generally yes, but let's say using a micro riveting system, or if the polymer is not a very smooth surface, let's say fabric with a lot of roughness, I think the mechanical anchorage effect may still have some effect. So in general, yes, but we need to experiment, really try the system, the material system. For the first question, how big we can make these materials, with the electroplating method, in theory, as long as you can fit into the fabrication device, a few inches, maybe half a foot, shouldn't be a problem. But if the substrate is flat, because you have residual stress coming from the fabrication, so the device may curl up.
Okay.
So most of the time we will use strips, thin strips, with a long aspect ratio, then the curling would be a lot less.
Okay, but in case I need a two-dimensional array of antenna, for example, so can you make a two-dimensional strip? Now, currently it's just a strip, right? In terms of strip, but in the future, can you make it into two-dimensional plates? Then you can roll it. All right.
I don't want to be too hard selling. For that type of things, you can use other SRMs. You can try, for example, the shape memory polymer.
Okay.
Because I've seen, for example, in Harbin Institute of Technology, there is a very famous scholar called Professor Lang. He actually gave the talk in our forum or our last activity through video. He did not come to Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And they were using shape memory polymers to even raise a flag in space. So I don't have the exact dimension of that, but from the video, that one could be like at least 1 or 2 foot as a square.
Okay.
So pretty large in area.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah,
Thank you very much, Alfonso. Thank you for everyone for those who asked questions. I would like to conclude today's activity by thanking every one of you still staying here. We have 2 eyes, the Polytechnic about AI and also Alfonso about MI. Now, I really don't know what will happen in the next decade or 2, but as long as there are human beings, then they will have business. Otherwise, there will be no AIs, no MIs. With that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. Okay, wish you all the best for the rest of the day. Okay, take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.